Right, well, it appears that I don't simply have the title for the purposes of the Electoral Commission, but I have actually got a job to do, and that's to chair this particular meeting. And there's somebody else coming in now. Oh, it's Paul. Now, the purpose of a chairman's report is supposedly to list the achievements, particularly of the last 12 months, or perhaps even the last 3 or 4 years since our formation. Some sarcastic people might quip that this should be the lightest of tasks. Perhaps our most solid achievement has been our continued existence, and also continued determination to fight elections. We haven't fought large numbers of seats, but we have consistently fought them when they arise. And also, of course, it mustn't be neglected, our determination to play our part in the Leave the EU referendum campaign. I know when we were out leafleting in Yorkshire, I can't remember an instance of seeing any other parties out leafleting. It appears that the other parties, as well as the coordinating bodies, concentrated on using the media to get their message across, whereas we, in our tiny existence, were at least out there using up shoe leather and putting leaflets through doors. I don't want to pretend that we played a decisive part in the winning of that referendum, but we played a part, considering the size of our organisation. If we had an expectation, as distinct from simply a hope, of forming a new mass party, then we must admit that we've failed in that. But, as I said way back in 2011, it's rare for new parties to survive and to emerge until the parties that they seek to replace have unambiguously disappeared. And that hasn't quite happened even today. But whilst we haven't succeeded in establishing a large mass party, we have created what I'd describe as a template or a pattern for an electable nationalist party. Our constitution is not only democratic, but it contains a unique element. A unique element, of course, put in by the person who wrote it, Adrian Davis. One of the things that's bedeviled nationalist parties over the years is that majorities, sometimes knife-edge majorities, have used those majority positions to purge minorities. In other words, to use the disciplinary procedures and the security apparatus, to the extent there is one, to engage in factional warfare. One of the provisions in this constitution, particularly choosing members of disciplinary committees before they arise, and then choosing people by lot from that bank, is one method by which that can be avoided. Secondly, our statement of policy. Not simply policies, but including principles upon which those policies are based. That's a second solid achievement that we've made. But I think in some ways the most solid achievement is the development of a new political culture, a political way of doing things. Whereas most nationalist parties have had always the threat of factional warfare, different people all wanting to be the top dog. I think the one distinguishing feature of our party is that we haven't been fighting for positions. If anything, we've been too deferential in trying to get other people to take them. Some cynics might say, that's why you're where you are, Andrew, for that very reason. But that leadership culture is important, and any new electoral party, whether it develops out of what we have here, or whether it's the result of the merger of this party and other parties, or whatever happens, it's essential that that culture must survive. because we want to make sure that we put an end to the ridiculous rivalries. I call them ridiculous because whoever in their right mind would want to be in charge of parties that are constantly lampooned by the media, perhaps they're people who are simply looking to be attacked and wanting to be attacked. Now, the question is, do we know whether the British Democratic Party will suddenly take off? Well, it might do, it might not. But what is important is that those achievements that we have survive. We must make sure that our policies are not simply concrete policies, but are based on clear principles, so that people can look at those principles, almost treating them as though they were the, if you like, the left-hand side of the equation, and then your left-hand side, not mine. And if you look at the principles on the left-hand side of the equation, you should be able to work out what our policies on the right-hand side of the equation are. And that is an achievement. We must make sure that any electable party has a constitution that is democratic and also faction-free and faction-safe. But most important of all, we must make sure that any organisation to emerge inherits our political culture, the culture of making sure that we stick by decisions that have been constitutionally made. We don't seek to break the rules in internal rivalries. We listen to each other with respect, and when decisions have been taken, we treat those decisions with respect. Now, there have been a number of attempts to bring people together. Chris Roberts is one of those people, not among our membership, but he's working conscientiously to create a mood for unity. He holds meetings regularly in London. Another person who's doing a complementary job is Jack Sen with his British Renaissance. British Renaissance isn't a political party, but it is, if you like, a meeting ground of people from a variety of parties. And I think that British Renaissance will be an important catalyst in the process of nationalist unity. And our continued existence, you might sometimes wonder, well, are we wasting our time? Are we achieving anything? Yes, I think we are. Those achievements that I've mentioned, but more important than that, our continued existence will give us a seat at that table when nationalist unity starts to engage. Now, in my view, we can make concessions about party names. It might well be that people want a different name from the one that we have. Fair enough. They might want different people to be in charge. Fair enough. I'm not going to fight anybody for any positions. But I do think our template, our pattern, must survive and must be adopted by whatever party emerges. A clear statement of not only policy, but political principles, a faction-safe constitution, and a political culture. If we have those on the labelling of an electable nationalist party, then I think the rest will follow, as surely as night follows day. Thank you. Now, as I say, I'm not only the person to give that address, but I'm also in charge of the meeting. So I'd like to invite our treasurer, Adrian Davis, to come out. I'll move up so that you can use the lectern.
Thank you very much, Andrew. To Andrew's list of real achievements by a small group of people, there's one more that I'd like to add. This is a small political party, but it is a highly solvent political party, point to which I'm going to come, and it is one whose financial affairs are run in a transparent and efficient manner without the appalling scandals, incompetence, chaos and worse that have afflicted similar groups down the decades. That is a first, to have a party that is not only honestly run, but transparently run. The late John Tyndall was a very honest man. He was a giver, not a taker, I think, of monies to the cause, but he believed the accounts should be kept secret from the hoi polloi and known only to the Odin-appointed leader of the British people, naturally himself, and the rest were all to be, in this respect, mushrooms. It was not a good system. It was fine so long as you had someone in charge who was a man of principle and integrity. It didn't work so well when there was a change of leadership and someone was in charge who was not a man of principle and integrity. Let me bring up to date our own situation. The party's accounts for 2015 were duly filed earlier this year with the Electoral Commission. They appear on the Electoral Commission's website, as do the accounts for the previous 4 years of its existence. I can tell you from the fact that I have had the personal misfortune of having to try to use that website, that it is about the clunkiest, worst laid out, worst indexed, most difficult to use website of any government body, and being a self-employed person, I have used Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs VAT site, so they were up against some tough competition. It is an appalling website. I am going to suggest that in future years, Frank, when he puts out the members' bulletin, includes with it the accounts so that all members receive them from the party and do not have to go looking on the Electoral Commission website to find them. Ours are actually not so difficult to find there, but they should still go out as an annex to or an insert into the members' bulletin in future years. The current position, I mean, the closing balance at the end of last year, I ought to be able to tell you, yes, there was a carried forward surplus of £3,410.65 at the end of 2015. The position has actually improved since then. We had, the last time I received a bank statement, which was for the 20th of October, £4,129 cash at bank, albeit from that must be deducted £312 for the PO box fee and £100 for the expenses of this meeting, including the hire of the call. So the reconciled balance on the bank account is now £3,717. Part of the reason for the improvement is that on the 24th of June this year, after years of complete silence from the gentleman in question, a balance of about £450 odd, which had formerly been held in a bank account in Newcastle upon Tyne, going back to the years when the party was administered there, suddenly popped up as an electronic transfer in the new account, which is held more locally to Leicester. So all credit to the former official in question. A mere 2 or 3 years after both Andrew and I had asked him to get his, never mind what, down to the local branch of Barclays, close that account and transfer the funds, he did deign to put himself into gear and do it. It took him a couple of years. That was my experience of doing anything with that gentleman, but we've got the money. So again, to his credit, all sums have been duly handed over, and we're in a good position. I would anticipate that we will prepare, or I will prepare, the accounts for 2016 really as soon as I receive the December bank statement. And I receive from Frank, who's very helpful in this regard, his summaries of receipts that he has banked, which are basically memberships and donations. So the party's essential financial position is positive. I can also tell you that quite independently of the party, I control a small legacy of a few £1,000s that was left to me by a sympathiser in London some years ago, upon which I can draw. Ironically, a man who twice been a Labour Party parliamentary candidate and twice got within a few hundred votes of being elected for that party back in the 1950s, but changed his views quite radically. But yes, I have a small legacy fund, which is not specifically designated for this party, but is at my discretion. So all in all, we are not short of money. Another thing that we have been able to do is actually to subsidise elections at the expense of fighting elections out of central funds. As those of you who've had experience of other such parties will know, the branches are usually required to subsidise the centre, not the other way round. We've done it with the centre subsidising the branches. So all in all, the party's overall financial position is healthy. I do, as I say, recommend that we adopt the practice of publishing these accounts every year to the members directly and not leaving it to go through the Electoral Commission. Apart from that, I think that the present procedures are completely satisfactory. We do have a provision for independent scrutineers to scrutinise the accounts. No one's ever asked me to scrutinise my accounts. If they'd like to do so, I shall be delighted to make them available. I think I'll get everything copied to PDFs and sent out. If people want to come and inspect the originals, they can. But there we are. Everything is running smoothly. Frank deserves thanks for dealing with the bankings of membership fees and subscriptions, and Paul for setting up the new bank account, all running well. I don't know, Andrew, you want to take questions perhaps later on, or have the three reports and then have the three of us take questions. That's probably the easiest way.
Yes, we can move on to the next item, which is the need for a viable electable nationalist party. Now, there are three, as you can see from the agenda, there are three sections to this. One is the historical perspective, which will be mine. The second one, the electoral perspective, which will be Paul. And the third one, the opportunities for the future, and that'll be Jim Luthwaite. Now, the word viable wasn't used very often at all at one point, and then it became a sort of fashionable buzzword, almost a filler word when people couldn't think of anything else to say and wanted to impress the people how well educated they were. But of course, viable does have a real meaning. Literally, it means livable or capable of living, capable of surviving, possibly capable of thriving. And those are qualities that nationalists in this country seem to find incredibly difficult. Why? Because whenever we go through a period of growth, inevitably a split follows. And those splits follow a number of distinct patterns. I was originally going to go through all of them historically, but I think by that time you'd have all sloped off, and I find myself standing here alone. But one of the circumstances appears to be when there's discontent following an election result, either because the election result was really bad, or, just as often, when it wasn't particularly bad, but fell short of rather too ambitious expectations. 1974, there were two general elections in a row, and the NF, the leading movement at the time, fought both of them, fought 54 seats, I think, in the first, and 90 seats in the second. Quite an achievement. And the votes were not bad, but of course there were those who thought the votes could have been much better. Again, following the 1979 election, there were three splits, one after the other. And in 2010, whilst I defended Eddie Butler's right to contest the leadership following that election, I didn't agree with him that the result, the BNP result, was that bad. If you compared it with UKIP, our vote was, I think it was 8 votes higher as an average vote. Yes, 8, not 88 or 800, just better. But better is better than worse. A second circumstance for these splits is where you get rivalries for leadership positions. Why ever would they want to be rivals for leadership positions, I ask myself, but there you are, no accounting for taste. And those rivalries tend to get out of hand. As I say, there are attempts by majorities, sometimes knife-edge majorities, to purge minorities, as though we had a sort of bottomless well of national activists and we can afford to get rid of swathes of them in order to secure somebody's leadership position. How absurd. Well, that happened in 1975. It happened again in 1986, and again in 2010. And then there have been attempts to remove particular individuals who were seen perhaps to be too embarrassing. John Tyndall, and I agree with everything that Adrian said about him earlier, who's an honourable man and personally pleasant man, and he was honourable and honest. But he did make mistakes in his younger day, as indeed did I, between the age of 17 and 18, but he made mistakes on photograph. And those mistakes certainly followed him. And then, of course, there's Nick Griffin, who, although he didn't quite dress up in Continental bus conductors' uniforms or anything of that kind, he certainly became toxic in the eyes of the public. He was considerably less popular than the party that he led. And then sometimes you get the existence of poisonous, vindictive people within parties, not a lot of these, but some of them, who I think are never enjoying themselves so much as when they're hating people. And that includes hating fellow nationalists. And I think the aforementioned person I mentioned, Nicholas John Griffin, would certainly fall into that category, as indeed would his former close allies, Clive Jefferson and Patrick Harrington. Two poisonous individuals I can't think of the equal of. And then I suppose lastly, disillusionment among the ordinary membership. So after you've seen the initial splits, other people simply fade away. They don't go anywhere in particular, but they feel that, that they've been entirely put off by the brawling leadership contenders. And that's, of course, the present period that we see. What are the solutions? Well, the education of our members about the history of those splits. I seem to remember talking to a group in the 1970s about this, and I pretended to know about Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, and whereas that starts by saying the history of the world is the history of class struggle, I said the history of the nationalist movement is the history of factional struggle, which indeed it has been. And I think members need to be told this so that they can prepare themselves for it and avoid it. Constitutional safeguards, such the one that I mentioned earlier. I hope you don't get embarrassed by all this praise, but that's the first time that I've ever seen that in the constitution of a nationalist party, possibly in the constitution of other parties as well. The idea that you don't, when disciplinary proceedings are required, you don't choose a hanging tribunal. You've already got your bank of people for a tribunal, and you choose them at random. So those people are not people who've been appointed to get rid of a rival. Most important. Constitutional checks and balances, again, so that you haven't simply got one centre of power, you've got several centres of power. So that if one of them starts to act wrongly, they can to some extent be criticised and checked by another. And lastly, again, I mentioned this earlier, the fostering of a political culture that when a decision has been taken, you accept it, even if you happened not to like it. When somebody has been elected to a position, then you accept that person has been elected. You don't seek to undermine them. A realization that you don't have to like personally everybody you work with. Sometimes, I even suspect some people find me irritating. Possibly you're finding me irritating at this very moment. But despite the fact that you find me irritating, as long as I have something to contribute, then you put up with me. I don't expect you to put up with me for too long, but just while I'm around. And I think we must follow the ordinary rules of civilized behaviour, and particularly rules that have been put into place. I remember the 2011 leadership election when Mr. Griffin sort of drew up these rules and then proceeded to break them. He gave himself 2 party election broadcasts, whereas the rest of us were only allowed, or I was only allowed one. They accused me of not paying debts that I hadn't contracted in the first place, and even implied that I might have been a little bit light-fingered. You know, it didn't matter that that kind of accusation would be damaging to the party. Now, looking at the word electable, there are some people in the past who've seen parties not as machines by which we achieve power and office, but almost as personal therapeutic institutions to make them feel good. And especially, of course, in times when we're not really achieving very much, when you join a party that, how can one put it, is a little bit bold, a bit out of the ordinary, and as I say, I was there 1964 to 65, it does give you that sort of wonderful, brave feeling. But then I'd grown out of that by the time I was 18. I'm afraid some people continued well into middle life. We've got to realise that isn't what parties are for. Then there are those who say there's no electoral road. I then hold my ear like this. I'm waiting for the next bit, and I'm waiting for what is the appropriate road. They keep that to themselves, I'm afraid. There's no electoral road, but they don't tell us what is the road. Well, to contradict that, the EU referendum. It wasn't supposed to end like that from the point of view of the establishment, but it has. The establishment doesn't always get its own way. I know Donald Trump isn't popular with everybody in this room, but nevertheless, even if we concede that he has certain flaws, he wasn't intended to be elected. The establishment figure was Hillary Clinton, and they were relying on her being elected. It went wrong for them, the fact that he was elected. Now, this business about what's the other route, I have sometimes, sarcastically I hasten to add, in case anybody thinks I was serious, do they think the route to power is, I don't know, armed revolution? Well, I don't think they really need, could possibly hope for that, because I'll tell you what, they wouldn't actually need the SAS to deal with electoral nationalists today. I reckon a couple of dozen traffic wardens would probably do the job well enough. Now, what does the word electable mean? Well, I think it must mean that we don't create avoidable impediments to being elected. You know, we don't put up somebody in a seat with a conviction for immoral earnings. Yes, that did happen in 1976. Was it? Oh dear, right. Would it be more acceptable had it been somebody else's? We'll leave that alone for the moment. But again, despite that, the NP did get 2 councillors elected in 1976. And then, 1994, the BNP wasn't making great progress, but it got Derek Beacon elected in the Isle of Dogs. And then in the 2000s, over 50 councillors were elected, 4 county councillors and 1 GLC member or GLA member. Oh, and of course, who are those 2 other people? Ah, that's right, MEPs. Now, getting people elected is half the job. The problem is, if once they're elected, they don't turn up, or they resign, or they do turn up but they don't say anything. I've heard it said that on one council, I can't remember which one it was, some of the other parties used to sing a little ditty, "Silence is golden," in relation to some of our elected members. But I will come to the defence of those people. In many cases, people fought and won elections because others were not able to stand. In this country, people in many professional occupations would find that their continuation in those occupations might be threatened if they were to stand as candidates. And quite often, the people who are prepared to stand would probably tell you themselves that they weren't the ideal candidates. So I think somehow what we need to do is not only make sure that we can get people elected, but we must in advance create a bank of candidates who, when they are elected, will not only turn up, but will actually make sure that they're seen to be doing a good job. We must make sure that they're electable, that they're not vulnerable to bullying, but also they're worthy of being in that position. And we have had such people. Jim Luthwaite raised the question of grooming in Bradford back in 2006, I think it was. And it's interesting that the other parties all gang together to vote down any discussion. Not to vote down his conclusions, but to take a decision that the matter wouldn't be discussed at all. And that included some councillors who have tried to make capital out of the situation since then. Chris Beverley in Leeds, a superb councillor, didn't miss a single meeting of the council or a single committee meeting. He made sure that money that was available to be spent in his ward was spent. I've been out canvassing with him, and people would stop him in the street and congratulate him on the things that he'd been doing and so on, including some people who hadn't bothered to vote for him. So there you are. So I hope that's filled in what's happened in the past, and if I can pass you over to Paul, who will give us an account of what has been going on the continent and elsewhere. We now move to the last item on the agenda. It sounds as if I'm stealing words from Adrian, and I can't think of a better person to steal words from, but we certainly live in deeply paradoxical times. At no time has the public throughout the world, in fact I'll be a little bit radical, throughout the white world, been so much in favour of the things that we're in favour. You know, France, Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, and now the United States with the election of Donald Trump. Whatever you might feel about Donald Trump, I think many of the people who voted for him were quite indisputably radical. The United Kingdom, of course, in a way is no exception. 3.8 million people voted for UKIP. All right, it's a phony nationalist party, but I don't know that all or even most of the people who voted for them knew that. So that is a sign of people waking up, not to mention the 17 million people who voted to come out of the EU. And yet, of course, the nationalist movement, I appear as I'm copying everything that you said, but I had written it first. I think he's been stealing my notes. And yet, of course, the nationalist movement in this country, even collectively, has never been. You say during your lifetime, you're a mere embryo of 54. Here I am, an old git of 69, and I can't remember a time when the nationalist movement has been so unpromising. It almost sounds as if I'm saying that gleefully, but I mean, it's so horrific. It's, of course, an easy temptation, and nationalists do this occasionally, and that's to blame the public. But on this occasion, at least, the public isn't at all to blame. They haven't acquiesced in the plight of our nation. In fact, at this particular time, the electorate has been more alert than it has been for decades. So we can't logically blame them. Perhaps the people who are to be blamed are members of the nationalist movement, or perhaps I ought to say former members of the nationalist movement who've walked away at the very moment when they're needed. Of course, some of them might be justifying it to themselves and saying, well, it's no longer necessary. We've got Brexit, and that nice Mr. Farage and his successors, whoever those might be, are doing rather well. Surely they'll look after our interests. Well, you've only got to look at the words of Mr. Farage, and I'm sure they apply to his successors as well. We are not an anti-immigration party. We want immigration. We welcome immigration. Those are the words of him, and I can't imagine that there'll be less the words of Paul Nuttall or any of the others. Of course, the President of the United States elected to a large extent, rather an imprecise mandate, but to a large extent on a mandate that we would look at favourably. Now, although the nation has awoken, that's to be said for it, it is nevertheless in a substantial state of confusion. I'm not blaming them for this. That confusion, that state of confusion, has been sedulously fostered for decades by people who know exactly what they're doing, and they're against us. People who, when they're asked to define Britishness, at best will say, like Farage did, people who live in Britain and pay their taxes. That's what he said. Somebody who lives in Britain and pays his taxes is British. Wow. Slightly more acceptable, you could say, people born in Britain. But we've even moved away from that. And I'll tell you who it did. A most surprising person who finally chopped that difference was it the 1982 Nationality Act, where chopped the qualification for being a British citizen of simply being born in Britain. And that was that nice Mr. Britain. Later on Lord Britain, later on not alive at all. But, give credit, well, yes, where it's applicable, that's right. I think that's far better. Now, the point is the establishment will spread these false messages. I think the worst one I've ever seen, the least plausible, is where they say it's people who share the same values. What absurdity. The idea that a nation is made up of people who share the same values, or worse still, perhaps putting it the other way around, people who share the same values are thereby nationals, is about as absurd as you can get. Now, if we want to get common sense on citizenship, on Britishness, on nationality, the best place we can go isn't Britain, or for that matter, other countries of Western Europe, but go to Eastern Europe. And I remember in the European Parliament, in our committee, there was a nice Mr. Schöpflin, a Jewish Hungarian citizen who was a member, an MEP and a member of our committee, and he said people in Eastern Europe know the difference between citizenship and nationality. Of course, even in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, they knew that difference. The difference is that nationality is descended. You ask who were your parents. It'd be a better idea if you actually knew who your parents were in the first place and didn't have to ask. But, you look at the nationality of your parents, and that will be your nationality. Where they have the same nationality, it will be that same nationality. If they have different nationalities, well, then choice comes to bear. I know there's a lady who I taught a few years ago, and we always used to refer to her as a Russian lady, but I later met her socially, and she said no. She said, my father's Ukrainian, my mother was Moldovan. So I said, what's that make you? So she said, well, I chose to be Ukrainian. And that's exactly what happens. But if we go back to the Soviet era, even in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, if somebody was born in one of the 16 Soviet republics, they were almost invariably a Soviet citizen. That wasn't in dispute. Citizenship is a legal relationship, unlike nationality, which is a biological relationship. But they would then, quite separately, put down officially what your nationality was. That nationality might be Russian, it might be Ukrainian, it might be Georgian, it might even be Jewish. There was a Jewish nationality recognized. Now, in my view, one of the nationalist movement's roles is not just to become an effective vehicle for gaining power. We haven't been terribly effective at that, have we, recently? So perhaps it's just as well we do have another role to fulfill. And it must be to propagate our message, our distinctive message of nationalist principles. The fact that nationality is not something that you gain by having shared values, by being resident in a place and paying your taxes, or even by being born in a place. It's by being descended from the same people. Now, if we're going to do this, then we must make sure that between elections, not so much at elections you've got to deal with the here and now, what we will do if elected. But between elections and in the longer term, we've got to produce literature that prepares the ground, prepares the soil, if you like, for the seeds of our ideas. And I would like to see us embarking on a series of ideological leaflets, not deep ones particularly, but I can see one headed Ancestry Matters. People pick it up and they think, oh, I wonder if this is a family history society. But then they see the subtext, yes, it does. It determines this and it determines that, and so on. And we must inform the people something that they might or might not know, and that is that distinctive people are not the product of distinctive cultures. Distinctive cultures are ultimately the product of distinguished and distinctive people. If you change the people significantly, the demographic change that Adrian was talking about, you don't leave everything else in place, you change the culture, you change the civilization. And if you remove or dilute or destroy the civilization creating and the civilization fostering section of the population, then the civilization will not survive, at least not to the same intensity and to the same degree. Change the people and you change the culture. Change the people physically or by dilution and you'll destroy the civilization that depends on it. Now, the opposite view, that of course is the dominant view as far as the education system is concerned and as far as the media is concerned, is the one invented by Frank Boas and propagated by his loyal, can we use the word loyal in the context of this dreadful woman, loyal disciple, Margaret Mead. Their idea was that we are the product of culture, and culture is something that can be taken off and put on just as easily as that. Now, our hereditarian message is relevant to race, culture, and civilization, though it is relevant to other things as well. Educational levels, grammar schools, perhaps, and social policy, and law and order. And it's in the area of the propagation of ideas that cooperation between various members of the nationalist movement, ostensibly in different organizations, might precede organizational unity. So in other words, it might be that organizational unity eludes us for a year or two, possibly 5 years. But there's no reason why there can't be a sort of nod, wink, understanding that we put that various nationalist parties and groups and informal groupings put a lot of emphasis on putting forward that important message that ancestry matters. Yes, it does. Now, notwithstanding our tiny size, I think our template, our pattern, our constitutional template, our policy template, our strategic template, but most of all, our ideological template can be won for us on its merits. And we don't need to squabble for positions with people who are currently in different nationalist movements, because we don't want positions for ourselves. We're not ambitious for our own positions, we're ambitious for our own ideas, and that's why we must fight for them. And ambition for one's ideas, as distinct for one's own future, is the most honourable in the political context. Perhaps, in fact, it's the only honourable idea of ambition. Thank you.